Next up, we're joined by my old friend, Tom Piazza, and former poker playing buddy. In addition to being my former poker playing buddy, Tommy is the author of 12 books, including A Free State and City of Refuge, the Post-Katrina Manifesto, Why New Orleans Matters, and the essay collection, Devil Sent the Rain. He was principal writer for the HBO series Treme. Tom won a Grammy Award for his album Notes to Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues, a musical journey. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, Book Forum, the Oxford American, and Bob Dylan, no less, says, Tom Piazza's writing pulsates with nervous electrical tension, reveals the emotions that we can't define. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Good to be here, Whit. Good to see you.
I can't believe I didn't know this about the poker. So, Tom, I hope somewhere in this conversation I can hear all about you taking all of Whitney's money.
Well, that's
it came and it went.
That's going to be a problem with him telling stories like that.
Oh boy, here it goes. 25 years ago, and we're still relitigating this. But
well, on this week's episode, we're talking actually about the 15-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and it has already been an active hurricane season, which seems to fit the 2020 aesthetic of complete suckage. We just witnessed Hurricane Laura barrel through Haiti, the DR, Louisiana, and Texas, and 10 hurricanes have hit Louisiana since Katrina. The New Yorker did an article in 2019 that says the Louisiana coastline loses a football field's worth of land every hour and a half. Do you even wonder if New Orleans is going to still be there in another 15 years?
Well, I mean, of course, but I also wonder, San Francisco is going to be there in another 15 years, or Lower Manhattan, or Miami, or the Outer Banks.
I think none of those places are going to be there. Maybe not in 15, but maybe 30 years. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but I guess one of the things that's been worthy of note in the years since Katrina is that people really do land on it so heavily as a New Orleans event. It was bigger than a New Orleans event, though, and these kinds of harbingers of climate change, et cetera, are, they're ubiquitous at this point, So I always try to push back just a little bit about making it too much a New Orleans thing. Although, of course, obviously, the mythic weight of New Orleans, the optics during the disaster, if you want to call them optics, and the sociology of it, the novelty of the hugeness of the devastation in American City obviously makes it stand out. And at this point, very much like with a lot of the other sort of social disasters we're watching, we're starting to get used to seeing it.
There's also some specific reasons, like I still teach a piece by John McPhee from his book Control of Nature about the Atchafalaya River, where he sort of explains, like, really, if there wasn't this river control structure at this one particular river junction upstream from New Orleans, that the Mississippi River wouldn't even go by New Orleans. There's some, unique geographical factors about New Orleans that make it hard.
That's right. It's hard not to worry. It's hard not to worry about what's going to happen to the city. I mean, it's famously below sea level. All that being said, it's probably better protected now than a lot of other places in southern Louisiana or southwestern Louisiana. What you said, Sugi, about the disappearance of the wetlands, the coastal wetlands, is true and extremely worrisome. And it's one of those kinds of things that you need a concerted governmental and societal response to, that we're not getting, because we don't want to face it, and it's expensive and it's tedious. It requires a lot of hard work without a lot of high profile publicity rewards for the people involved in doing it.
So in New Orleans, I'm told that the high water marks from Katrina remain on buildings even now. And I'm wondering about other ways that the culture of the city has changed and adapted to Katrina's memory. And if someone wanted to visit, No, I've never been to New Orleans. Where would you tell me to go if you wanted me to understand the way that Katrina changed the city? Are there spaces that have disappeared, ones you wish you could show an outsider but can't?
Yeah. Well, we used to do a thing for several years after the disaster. My partner Mary and I would often sort of trade off on doing what we called the disaster tour, because a lot of people started coming, certainly a couple of years after the storm. And then I say the storm, but it's really the failure of the federally constructed levees that really made the difference in New Orleans. I mean, coastal Mississippi got absolutely decimated by Katrina. And that was a natural disaster. What happened in New Orleans was a failure of planning and then a failure of the execution of the plans in terms of the levee system and stuff. So we would go to Gentilly, these neighborhoods. It's a city of neighborhoods. We'd go to Gentilly, we'd go to Broadmoor, we'd go to Lakeview, and probably most famously, I guess, the lower Ninth Ward. And those places are still there to see. You know, some of the buildings still have marks on them. The city has come back extraordinarily well, I would say. Really, 15 years ago, if you had said that the city would be where it is today, it would have been a little hard to believe. So anyway, I guess probably if you were to come to the city today, I would say, let's go take a ride down to the lower Ninth Ward. And I would have to, because it's there where probably the damage that remains, the damage that hasn't been reconstructed, what have you, is probably the most widespread and the easiest to show. It's just hard to describe what one saw. You know, 6 months after the disaster, you would go down there and it was just, there were houses in the middle of the street. There were semi-trucks upside down. It was just like something you saw in photographs and newsreel footage of bombing in Europe after, in World War II. Just the devastation was, it would strike you dumb.
I write mostly about Sri Lanka, and I'm reminded of kind of the post-tsunami, post-Indian Ocean tsunami,
wow.
and post-war tourism, which sounds like in some ways adjacent to what you're describing. You're talking about New Orleans as a city of neighborhoods, and you wrote for David Simon's HBO series Treme, which was just named for one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, in a historically Black neighborhood, and it's adjacent to the French Quarter, if I remember correctly. I'm wondering how the real Treme looks these days. And I mean, lots of Black and Indigenous people and people of color were displaced to Dallas and Atlanta after Katrina. And how many of those folks were able to return, and how have those neighborhoods changed?
Well, as a general remark, New Orleans is certainly a younger city now and a whiter city than it was before Katrina.
Oh, really? I did not know that. Oh, that's interesting. So it's like it was like a gentrification process happened after the hurricane. Is that what it was like? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Like
disaster capitalism, like Naomi Klein. That's not exactly right, but
well, it's so much of the city was just decimated by the disaster, and in the rebuilding process, it's a place where there's a lot of how would you say? There was a lot of relatively inexpensive property. It's always been a place, at least ever since I've been coming here, it's always been a place where creative people, imaginative people could come and live and be who they are more affordably than they could in a lot of other metropolitan urban areas that you might have wanted to live in, than New York, San Francisco, Chicago. I mean, tick them off. So that has begun to change, because about the last figure I heard was that about 10% of the city's population right now came here, has arrived, has moved here after Katrina. That's a big percentage, 10% of the city. Obviously, not all of that 10% is white young, affluent people, but a big proportion, is.
The characters in your excellent 2008 novel about Katrina, City of Refuge, also live in the Ninth Ward. We're talked a lot about the Ninth Ward. I want to talk about why that place is important to you as a writer, and why it's important to the city, and also maybe just for people who haven't been to New Orleans, and even for me, I've only been there once. I hear the Ninth Ward, but I don't really know where it is or what it looks like, really, other than what I've seen on TV.
Well, what it looks like now is considerably different than what it looked like, right after
Let's
Katrina.
talk about what it looked like then, or right before Katrina and then afterwards, like what was lost, really.
The lower Ninth Ward was not necessarily, one of the iconic, if you want to use that term, neighborhoods of the city, the way, say, the Garden District is, or Tremé even, or the French Quarter, whatever, a part of the city that had a very distinctive style of architecture. What you would have seen before the disaster going through the lower Ninth Ward was just a very standard working class part of New Orleans. You saw the houses were basically wooden frame houses, what they call shotgun houses here, right? Which is to say houses that present a narrower aspect to the street and then go back. They named it that because you could stand at the front door and shoot a shotgun and it would go all the way to the back of the house. So it was those kinds of houses, modest for the most part, fairly close together, and a place where working people lived, and they had a culture down there. People knew each other. A lot of times people had been there for generations. So it's not as if I could tick off a bunch of landmarks. There were neighborhood saloons, neighborhood shops. I set City of Refuge partly in the Ninth Ward. As you know, that novel is divided between a somewhat affluent family of white transplants from the Midwest. The husband in the family, Craig, was a big New Orleans fan and sort of really wanted to live here and came down here with his family. And so they had a certain set of resources, a certain set of reasons for being here, reasons for staying, but options also in the wake of the storm. And the family that I chose to place in the lower Ninth Ward, a very representative kind of family. The head of the family is a carpenter and built the house they lived in. So partly I chose the Ninth Ward as a contrast, and as a place that got hit very, very, very hard, catastrophically during Katrina. What happened there was that there was a canal that forms the border between what they call the lower Ninth Ward and the upper Ninth Ward. And it's called the Industrial Canal.
Which you mentioned in the very first paragraph of the book. I was just looking back.
And so that apparently a barge got loose or something and knocked into the levee that protected the lower nine, from the water in the Industrial Canal. And when that broke, it was like a bomb going off. And really a tsunami of water flooded into the lower Ninth Ward and raised the buildings there. I mean, it was only it's a kind of a stupid comparison maybe to make, but you see pictures of the aftermath of the bombing in Hiroshima. Why is this one house still standing over here and everything around it has been flattened? It was sort of like that in the lower nine. It was also a place with amazing vibrancy. It was a great neighborhood. People knew each other. People had block parties. People took care of each other. People looked out for each other. People supported each other when there was trouble, So I think a lot of people who were looking on from outside wondered why anybody would ever want to rebuild there. Why would anybody want to go back? And the answer is because it's your home. And there was a community there that sustained people, not just economically or, but spiritually. New Orleans is a deeply spiritual place.
Before we run out of time, I want you to read this essay from Devil Sent the Rain called In Continental Drift, which also was first published in the Huffington Post, so people can find it there if they want
it's
online.
It is, yeah.
but it connects some of these ideas, I think, that we're talking about, and connects Katrina to this other sort of sequential failures of the federal government and our leaders, which is also something that Christina K. Robinson, our first guest, has talked about a lot. So I think it'll really be interesting to listen to. So,
yeah, this was a piece I wrote in 2015, the 10-year, no, 2010, I'm so sorry. It was the 5-year anniversary. And I'm sure people, maybe some few people are left who actually remember that far back in the general amnesia. That was the year that the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sorry, hold it up for a second if you would. Not getting choked up. Something went down the wrong pipe.
yeah, just make sure you're fine and then count back in backwards. And so the screen's on you and then go back to that Deepwater Horizon thing.
Right. 3, 2, 1. So I wrote this piece in 2010 when the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf of Mexico. I describe it a little bit in here. And it was also the 5th anniversary right around then of Hurricane Katrina. And, you know, all the media descended on New Orleans as they did on the 10th anniversary, slightly less now on the 15th anniversary. I'm sure 20 will be a big one. And, well, I'll just read the piece. It's called In Continental Drift.
Which I just want to say is like, is that a quote of Russell Banks's Continental Drift novel, or is it connected
Continental
to it?
Drift is
the term, geological term?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So already the captains and kings had departed along with their attendant media grandees. It was nice of them to stop by New Orleans for the anniversary and give everybody around the country and the world a look from what must seem a comfortable distance. Just 5 years ago, water was cascading into the lower 9th Ward, into Lakeview, into Gentilly and Mid-City and Broadmoor and St. Bernard. It would take a day or two, but the entire world was about to see what was possible in America circa 2005. At first, it looked as if New Orleans had been smacked by a hurricane, which of course it had. It would take a while longer for people to understand that the images that halted the coffee cup en route to the mouth, or that kept their eyes open and fixed on the news past bedtime, were the result not of a natural disaster, bad as the hurricane was, but of a catastrophic planning and engineering failure on the part of the Army Corps of Engineers. Many still don't realize it. Of course, many also think that Iraq planned the 9/11 attacks. And then this summer, BP, it became a mantra. You poor guys down there. First Katrina flooded your city, and now this. All this spillage, it was getting kind of embarrassing. To be an American, I mean. We had had some dicey moments before Katrina, to be sure. The savings and loan scandal, then Enron, then WorldCom. Nobody's going to remember these, by the way, anymore at this point. It's been so eventful. They proved relatively easy to contain, and importantly, they offered no searing visual images to disturb the sleep of the Republic. By the time Katrina hit, we had been hemorrhaging money, human blood, and credibility in Iraq for 2 years. But we had a story to cover that. We had been attacked. The mainstream media mostly went along with that particular narrative, even though it had nothing to do with the war in question. Katrina, however, was different. Katrina exposed something rotten at the root. The federally built levees were weak as a wino's teeth, and the governmental response to their failure was worse than inept. The federal government suddenly, glaringly, resembled a drunk who had all too publicly lost control of his, shall we say, faculties. 3 years later, in 2008, at least partly as a result of the previous losses of financial control, Wall Street and the housing market sheepishly said, "We've had a little accident." And a massive dose of antidiarrheals in the form of endless debt for future generations was required to keep the body politic from draining out completely. 2 years later, another manifestation of the great incontinence, an oil well that ruptured and could not stop. Millions Billions? Who's counting? Of gallons of oil billowing out into some of the most ecologically sensitive waters on the planet. The government stood by wringing its hands as BP lunged at a series of ill-considered and untested solutions, one after another, falling repeatedly on their faces like country boys trying to catch a greased pig. As their veins become less forthcoming, junkies, old-timers who have been shooting for years, are known to look for a place to hit anywhere, between their toes, in their groins. Well, we Americans were famously addicted to oil, and with the Deepwater Horizon blow-up, the needle had broken off and the earth itself seemed to be bleeding uncontrollably. It was an image from the darkest wells of the collective psyche, a nightmare. They tell us that dreams exist to bring to light material that we're having trouble facing directly when conscious. What are these bad dreams telling us? The result of uncontrolled indulgence is ultimately a lack of control when you need it most. Americans don't want to hear it, but we're not kids anymore, no matter how hard we try to act like it. There is an incontinence at our center now that is the result of years, decades, of telling ourselves that our destiny was manifest, our entitlement endless. We could spend uncountable amounts of money on a foreign war and offer tax cuts to the wealthy at the same time. We could consume energy without giving it a second thought. After all, we would be dead by the time the account ran dry. We could toss the regulatory chains from the shoulders of the oppressed banking and investment industry. The regulations were, after all, so 1933. We could cut corners on crucial infrastructure projects since the odds were that the levees and bridges and pipelines and dams wouldn't fail anytime soon. As a result, we're finding new orifices from which to bleed and drain at an ever-accelerating rate. How's New Orleans doing? We're doing all right. We have a new mayor, we're strong, but how are you doing? The levee failures, the BP spill, the financial meltdown, all share the same root. Somewhere, the nation lost the common sense understanding that corporations and government agencies can't be expected to regulate themselves. Or perhaps we've only lost the will to act on the understanding. The levees have been repaired, yes, in the places where they broke. The oil well has finally been capped, and all the oil has either evaporated or been eaten by microbes. You believe that? The too big to fail financial institutions have had their bad gambling debts paid by Big Daddy. Sleep well. It may be comforting to imagine that Katrina and this year's BP disaster happened down there, but from down here, they appear to be happening right in the middle of everything. On the day of the anniversary, the president, for whom I voted so proudly not even 2 years ago, Barack Obama, spoke in New Orleans, promising, as did his predecessor, a full recovery. But on the larger stage, he is, dare I say it, pissing away his chance to articulate that oh so crucial sense of urgency, summon the necessary will to address a flawed underlying logic, rather than merely cleaning up the mess afterward. I know he doesn't want to be called a socialist, but if we can't figure out a way to grow up and fast, there will be no diaper in the world big enough for us.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, we urge you to pick up City of Refuge, Why New Orleans Matters, or any of Tom's books. And of course, to watch Treme on HBO if you can. Tom wrote a 2018 article in the Oxford American on John Prine, who passed in April from COVID-19, which we'll also put in our show notes. Tom, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. We'll talk soon, I hope.
Okay, Whitney. I hope so.